iron, and lead mining began to grow exponentially, which made the country incredibly rich. With that being said, famine and poverty was still rife in Tudor England. In 1530, however, the cruel laws against beggars were abolished, and vagrants were allowed to beg as long as they had a license. This led to an influx of beggars, which resulted in a new law being passed in 1547, which meant that anyone caught begging would be imprisoned for 2 years. In 1550, this law was changed again, with the punishment for the vagrant being a flogging, which meant that they were struck on the back with a whip or rod. The rule of Elizabeth I introduced the Poor Law in 1601, which gave the poor a tax relief, as well as other forms of support. It was during this time that the criminal system took a preference to physical punishments, rather than being thrown into prison. This included flogging and putting into stocks, which would add humiliation to the punishment. Those who committed the more serious crimes, such as murder, still resulted in execution. The noble and affluent criminals would still be beheaded like previous centuries, while the poor and common population would be hung at the gallows, often with crowds gathering to watch the spectacle. A focus on education came with the Tudor period, with Richard Mulcaster, the educationalist, insisting that a boy's education was the most important, as they were more worthy. This led to boys from wealthy families being sent to grammar school and universities before the girls. Despite a female monarchy ruling over the country, the future of girls was predetermined to be that of wives and mothers, well versed in needlework, cooking, and cleaning. Eventually, girls were given the right to get an education, although it was limited to only reading and writing. Eventually, local schools were established where boys and girls would study together. It was during the Tudor period that leisurely activities began to rise. Many people began playing tennis and football, as well as watching jousting events and gambling. The more affluent of society played chess and gambled by playing card games, such as Primero and Noddy, which was the precursor to cribbage. After Elizabeth I passed away in 1603 and the reign of the Tudors came to an end, James VI became king. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been executed for treason and had become a martyr for the Catholic faith. While many hoped that James would support the Catholic religion, he refused to repeat the same mistakes as Queen Mary by trying to roll back the Reformation. When the Catholics living in England didn't get the support they wanted, a group of people began to plot an assassination. This plan involved blowing up the Houses of Parliament on a day that they knew the king would be present. In 1605, Guy Fawkes and his group of conspirators stored a large volume of gunpowder in a storeroom that was directly below the House of Lords. Unfortunately for the conspirators, the plan was foiled on November 5th, which led to all of the men being hung, drawn, and quartered. This day became known as Bonfire Night, celebrated with fireworks every year on November 5th. Despite the assassination attempt, on the whole, James brought peace to the country, joining England and Scotland together, who had previously been locked in conflict. After James died, it was his son Charles that took the throne in 1625. Charles was devoted to the Anglican Church and loved the arts, which was reflected in his rule without a parliament in place. Eventually, he was forced to recall Parliament so he could raise money, but he refused to give them any power and control over the land and church. This led to a civil war breaking out in August 1642. This conflict snowballed, with the number of people killed estimated to be in the millions through the 9 years it raged on. The civil wars forced castles to go into service, some of which hadn't been used for their military purpose since the Middle Ages. Many of them were sieged by opposing factions in order to gain strongholds that would provide a strategic advantage. In 1647, King Charles was defeated by the Parliament's army, led by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. Charles was held prisoner at Carisbrooke Castle, where peace negotiations were to take place. Unbeknown to Fairfax and Cromwell, however, Charles was secretly planning a second civil war, which broke out a year after he was imprisoned. This led to the king being executed in 1649. The news that a king had been beheaded shocked Britain and Europe, which led to the future Charles II trying to invade the country with the help of the Scots. This attempt failed, with Charles only avoiding death by hiding inside an oak tree at Boscobel in Shropshire. Government and church powers weakened after the beheading, which saw the rise of new and radical ideas, often spread through pamphlets. Growing religious sects began to preach about the second coming of Christ, a belief that spread throughout the country. At this time, Oliver Cromwell ruled the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, donning the title of Lord Protector. Although Cromwell had his own radical religious views, he allowed all religions to be practiced throughout the country. Cromwell used his army to keep control of the country right up until his death, when his forces weakened, and Charles II was free to return in 1660 to rule the country. The reign of Charles II, which spanned 25 years, saw changes to art, architecture, daily life, and leisure. In fact, it was this period that saw the revival of theaters. This period also brought some incredible scientific discoveries, such as the manufacture of phosphorus, which was dipped into wooden splints to create matches. With that being said, there were several disasters that happened during this time, including the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London that broke out in 1666, after a fire broke out in a small bakery. The Catholic brother of the king, James, went under heavy criticism about whether he should be the next king. Regardless, he succeeded his brother, becoming King James II. While the king defended the throne against the Duke of Monmouth, his illegitimate Protestant brother, he became disliked by many for the violent trials of the rebels and policies put forward by the king. Eventually, William of Orange and the daughter of James invaded England, which led to James fleeing and the pair being crowned king and queen. The rule of William III and Mary II marked a peaceful period for the country. Mary's sister Anne took the throne afterward in 1702. While her reign was known for the victory over Louis XIV, the most monumental event was the Act of Union, which saw the beginning of a united Great Britain. Now, we've spoken a lot about the monarchy and rule, as it was the rich and powerful that could learn to read and write to document their lives and historical achievements. But what were the lives of everyday Britons like in the Stuart era? Most of the common people during this era were poor, with some forced to live in terrible conditions. This was only made worse by the influx in population, which saw entire areas impoverished and starving. This led to poor laws being implemented, which were first introduced a century before by Elizabeth I, which helped the poorest people of the country. Most of those working have a master above them who would provide them with a room and wages to live off. Vagrancy became a huge issue during this period, as the most impoverished of people were forced to beg or claim charity from family and neighbors. In fact, many poor people chose to travel to the New World in order to change their lives and make money. While times were most difficult at the start of the Stuart period, things got better near the end of it. For the poor, the focus was on finding the next meal. When food stocks were down, people concentrated on the harvest industry. When soldiers during the Civil War were waiting for payment, many of them resorted to stealing crops and livestock, which heavily affected the industry and led to more starvation. While the working class ate legume-based diets such as beans, soybeans, and lentils, the affluent ate rich meat diets and very sweet desserts. This led to many illnesses as a result, including diabetes and hemorrhoids. While there was a lot of poverty in England, many people held jobs to provide for their families. Merchants and store owners flourished during the Stuart era, which gave them the money to leave London when the plague broke out. In the country, many people were employed as shoemakers, blacksmiths, tailors, saddle crafters, and glovers, just to name a few. On the streets and cities of towns, many people sold a variety of wares, from oysters to furniture, as well as offering services that ranged from shoe shining to prostitution. Those working on farms would be in charge of milking cows, collecting eggs, tilling the fields, and taking care of the livestock. During this period, like those that came before it, roles were defined by the sexes, with girls expected to follow the orders of their father, brothers, husbands, and then their sons. The wife and mother of the family were put in charge of running and cleaning the house, preparing food, and raising the children. If a woman came from a wealthy family, she could avoid marriage and the duties that came with it, while poorer women chose to work as servants, wet nurses, or midwives. The sad truth is that many women only found freedom after being made a widow. Some could argue that when it came to relationships, aristocratic families had it more difficult than common people. The reason for this was because the influential and wealthy were forced to marry due to political or financial reasons rather than genuine love. Marriage was so important during Stuart Britain that an act was passed in 1604 that stated that a man who left his family or committed bigamy would be deemed a rogue, which would merit a punishment. For example, a case went to trial over a man named Thomas Middleton, who had to provide evidence to prove he was only married to one woman. In the later part of the Stuart era, a document called the Political Arithmetic was published, which talked about all of the people working in England, including those working in agriculture and manufacturing. In it, William Petty, the writer, expressed his concern about how gold and silver were now in scarcity, and that the country was growing poorer by the day. He also claimed that the focus on Ireland, Scotland, and America was a burden to the country and provided no advantage. While this opinion may sound harsh, many shared the opinion that England had overstretched its assets, which now meant the population was suffering as a result. By the early 17th century, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were unified with England, and in 1707, Queen Anne officially packed the Acts of Union. Sadly, life expectancy was much shorter than that of today, with the likelihood of children dying being incredibly high. In fact, childbirth was dangerous for both the mother and the child. Without the medicines and treatments we have today, if the trauma and pain didn't kill the mother, infections would soon after. Experts believe that 25 women out of 1,000 died giving birth during the Stuart period. Other things that killed young people during this era were worms, plague, and dysentery, as well as an illness known as griping in the guts, which killed people through diarrhea and crippling stomach pain. A major factor in these kinds of illnesses came down to personal hygiene, which the Stuarts did not hold in high regard. This also led to parasites like fleas and lice infesting every level of social class. Intestinal worms were also common, with eggs being laid or passed into foods when being prepared. In their spare time, people living in the Stuart period would enjoy dancing, singing, and listening to live music at music halls and other venues. While higher classes went to the theater, common folk would enjoy betting on cock and dog fighting. Another blood sport that brought many people together were public executions, which would be held in town squares. During the Stuart era, food and drinks from other countries began to become popular in England. The reason for this was down to the global trade routes established via road and ocean, which also introduced wares never seen before on British soil. This included furs from North America, tea from China, and spices from India. This is where the palate of the British people changed, with exotic wares and ingredients being welcomed into the culture. By 1633, strange yellow fruit known as bananas were found on market stalls, while the first coffee houses and tea rooms opened their doors. It was here that many people would visit to discuss politics and other business. During its early days, coffee was considered to be a man's drink, which led to women being banned from visiting the coffee houses. Women looking for a warm drink could visit tea rooms, however, while hot chocolate was available to higher class members of both sexes. The 18th century, known as the Georgian era, saw the rise of the Industrial Revolution, where England was dominated by the age of steam, network of canals, and factories manufacturing on a larger scale. With that being said, the workshops were still small, such as textile workers who would spin weave, dye cloth, and repair clothing. This industry was made up of thousands of small-scale operations. Areas of Britain specialized in a specific area of industry, such as metal production in the Midlands, mining in the Northeast, and glasswork in the West Midlands. State-of-the-art technologies led to breakthroughs in agriculture and industry, which changed the country exponentially. Food production was increased, which ensured that there were plenty of it to go around. Affording it, on the other hand, was a different matter for the poor. Foreign workers and vagabonds offered cheap labor, which created mass unemployment across the country, especially in rural villages. This led to many people living in the country relocating to larger towns and cities to find work. These people were welcomed into the growing factories, which in turn increased manufacture and the development of technology. The only thing that slowed down production, however, was the limited power sources, with many businesses relying on water wheels, windmills, and horses to work large tools and machines. With the advancement of steam, introduced by Thomas Newcomen and his steam-driven piston engine, industries now had a way of increasing their workflow, as well as pumping water from flooded mines, transporting goods across the country via trains, and powering large textile mills. By the late 19th century, around 2,000 steam engines were in use in Britain. The Derby family of Shropshire re-imaged the iron manufacturing process, which offered stronger metals that were ideal for making machines and larger tools. With the help of steam engines, coal mining was made more efficient. In turn, the spoils were used to power steam engines across the company. This means that coal was one of the most valuable industries in the entire country. In 1769, Richard Arkwright created the water frame, which allowed large-scale textile spinning to take place. A short time later, James Hargreaves's spinning jenny was made available, which made cotton spinning much easier. In 1780, Edmund Cartwright's power loom continued this string of advancements, which made cheap clothing available to the entire population. As steam industries continued to evolve, so did the types of businesses using them. Factories began sprouting up all over the country, which provided goods and materials to many parts of the world. These companies provided jobs on a scale that had not been seen before. For example, Richard Arkwright's cotton factories in Nottingham saw almost 600 employees at their peak, while some factories in Birmingham had almost 1,000 employees at any one time during the 1770s. Even children were employed, as their small hands were ideal for intricate work, such as making buckles, buttons, and locks. Many of these businesses were incredibly dangerous work environments, not to mention that the workers were treated poorly. In fact, many compared some factories to prisons, with those who made mistakes or not working hard enough facing physical discipline. Workhouses and orphanages would send children to work in factories and mines, which put them in danger. Some would pass out through heat, while others got caught in fast-moving machinery as they were sent through them to maintain them. The canal systems, created to transport the coal supply around the country, also provided jobs for many people. The early systems were limited but incredibly important. For example, the canal commissioned by the Duke of Bridgewater connected Worsley to Manchester, which halved the price of coal within just a couple of weeks. With the success of the already existing canal networks, more and more were commissioned by the government. In 1815, over 2,000 miles of canal were available in Britain, transporting thousands of tons of precise metals, coal, and wares on barges towed by horses. With the focus being on the canals, the roads were left in a very poor state, many of which were flooded or overgrown with vegetation. This caused trades that traveled via wagon and cart to suffer. With food unable to be delivered by using the roads, Britain was facing a problem. To rectify it, the government passed the Turnpike Acts, which allowed new roads to be built and used a toll system to pay for their construction and upkeep. Headed by engineers like John McAdam and Thomas Telford, roads began to spread throughout the country in the 1780s. The improved roads not only allowed trades to operate again, but they actually made it more efficient. This meant that a stagecoach could travel from Edinburgh to London in just 2 days, which almost took 2 weeks 50 years previously. This was groundbreaking at the time, and further revolutionized industry in Britain. The people of Britain adopted a strange fascination for criminals and lawbreakers during the late 1700s, with those committing crimes being depicted as heroes in newspapers and printed pamphlets that were circulated throughout the streets. Tales of daring thefts and crimes led to highwaymen, people who preyed on traveling carriages, becoming celebrities. These characters became legends and inspired many others to do the same. When a thief called Jack Sheppard was publicly hung in 1724, 200,000 people turned up to celebrate his career. Another, the flamboyant John Rann, was met with his adoring fans in the street of London after he was found not guilty of a theft. For others, the rise and growing popularity of crime was worrying. Thefts were at an all-time high, and those committing the deeds were not being caught or punished. There was an outcry for criminal investigations and punishments to be improved, which eventually led to the police force we know today. Although it was very different in the early days, back then, the punishment of criminals was left down to the victims, who were in charge of the investigations. While there were 2 constables in each parish, these were people elected in the community who worked on a voluntary basis. This means that most of the police work was done after the men had done their day job, with some of them paying others to do the duty for them. Later, a group of paid watchmen were hired in London, known as Charlies, who were close to what we know of modern policing today. These men would patrol the street, perform investigations, and arrest criminals. Part of their duties was to bring drunk people home and yelling out the time for people. Many accused the watchmen of being ineffective and cried out for changes to be implemented in the system. This opinion was listened to in the 1750s, with professional forces being established. In 1751, Henry Fielding started the Bow Street Runners, which saw the first armed men carrying out investigations and arrests on behalf of the public. The suspects of these crimes were judged by local magistrates without a jury having any say in determining guilt. This, of course, led to many innocent people being imprisoned or executed for crimes they didn't commit, whether it was done through wrongful conviction or political motives. Once again, these officials were volunteers who were elected from influential members of society. This meant that many of them were not well versed in the law and took the position as a statement of power rather than justice. Horace Walpole, an English writer, once said that the greatest criminals of society were the officers of justice, referencing the corruption within British law. This, in many cases, was true, with several taking bribes or being reluctant to perform their duties out of laziness. The most serious crimes, like rape and murder, were dealt with by the Crown Court, which were located in large towns, or the famous Old Bailey. The experience for common people standing trial was scary, with the stench of unwashed criminals being covered with scented flowers and herbs, which were also believed to stop the disease from spreading. Much of the trial was done in Latin, as was tradition, which meant many suspects were confused as to what was being said, or the details being put forward. To make things worse, criminal defenses were not introduced until the later part of the Georgian period, which meant that witnesses were examined by the judge and jury members. If these officials took a disliking to the character of the suspect, they would be found guilty without all the facts being known. In fact, these cases were over in a matter of minutes, with several cases being conducted in a day to speed the process along. In the early 1800s, courts abided by the Bloody Code, which was a list of 200 crimes that justified an execution. These included crimes such as treason, rape, and murder, as well as less serious crimes like stealing, the poaching of animals, and even vandalism. Fortunately for many, most of these crimes that could merit death ended up with imprisonment. Regardless, this struck fear in the hearts of many, with the idea of visiting the gallows for a crime they didn't commit being a very real possibility. Those who were unfortunate enough to face the gallows were done so in a public spectacle, with hundreds of people turning up to watch the life of a criminal snuffed out. While many saw it as twisted entertainment, it was done as a deterrent for others. Up until 1783, the hangings took place at Tyburn, Middlesex, 8 times a year, with up to 20 criminals hung at the same time. Those sentenced to death would endure a 3-mile cart ride to the gallows, which would be mobbed by hundreds of people screaming and throwing things. Once they were all lined up on the wooden scaffolding, the noose would be tied around their necks and trap doors would open. After the executions, white doves were released as a symbol of respect, after which a moment's silence was insisted. Many criminals were often sent to American colonies, as well as Australian colonies, to serve their sentences through hard and unpaid labor. Other punishments included hefty fines, being flogged and whipped, and literally branded a criminal with a burning hot rod. These punishments were often done under the watchful eye of the public, who were allowed to pelt them with rotten fruit and vegetables. Lifelong imprisonment was also implemented at the end of the Georgian period, which were known as houses of correction. With the advancements of industry seen in the Georgian era, the 19th century saw a period of exponential growth that carried on through to the Victorian era. At this point, industries of rural and agriculture were dwarfed by factories and urbanization. This sudden change was a culture shock to many communities, and it took a while for the government and the people of Britain to get used to this new way of life. The Victorian era started in 1837 and ended around the outbreak of the First World War, despite Queen Victoria passing away in 1901. It was during this era that Britain saw another boom in the population, with figures doubling between 1801 and 1871. This was down to people being able to afford the upkeep of larger families as a result of the work opportunities the Industrial Revolution provided. Migration in the country increased population, although many left the country also. In fact, a large number voluntarily left for the American colonies in search of a better life in the New World. Large groups of Irish workers made up a majority of the migrants, especially in 1845, during the Irish potato famine that caused starvation in many parts of the country. People from Ireland, Scotland, and the English countryside flocked to industrial cities for work, as well as Jews from Europe and Russia. While conditions for working children were awful, a legislation for protecting child and adult workers was passed by Parliament, which was campaigned by Michael Sadler and the Earl of Shaftesbury. This forced safer procedures to be implemented within mines and factories, and also put an end to slavery within the British Empire. Education for children younger than 10 was also made compulsory, which nurtured the prospect of common people taking up more skilled jobs. The police force, which had evolved a lot since the 19th century, was more organized and efficient. They also began a prison reform program that saw conditions within prisons greatly improve. While there still were clear social class divides, social freedom and the ability to keep more of their money had improved many lives. Entrepreneurs taking advantage of the opportunities within the Victorian era used their wealth to rise in society, building huge houses and emptying domestic servants to take care of the household. In fact, in the 1880s, 1.25 million people in Britain were working as domestics, which was more than any other industry. This was the first time that the hierarchy wasn't governed by royalty or lordship, which ushered in a new era of social change. The working class was eventually allowed to vote in 1918, with the suffrage of women ending in 1930. In 1776, Britain lost the American Empire after America declared independence during the American Revolutionary War, which resulted in the empire turning its sights to India instead. Throughout the Victorian era, the expansion into other countries continued, which opened up more trade routes and prompted more conflicts. In 1851, the Great Exhibition presented industrial and technological wonders to the world. At this point, the British Empire was the leader of trading and military strength, making it a force to be reckoned with. In fact, the British Empire held so many territories that the sun never set upon the empire, referencing how far their control reached. It was during the Victorian period that leisure really boomed, with religious holidays, seaside vacations, museums, theater, sports, and music halls hitting peak popularity. With better education and opportunities, middle-class members of society could now become skilled laborers. For the poor, however, circumstances were just as bad as those seen centuries before. The houses of the middle class evolved during this period, with iron cooking ranges appearing in most homes. These ovens not only cooked food more efficiently than before, but also heated tanks that provided hot water. Gas-powered geysers also sent hot water from the tanks to the bathroom, which eliminated the need for a maid to carry buckets of heated water up the stairs. The coffee shops that were once a hub for the affluent and politically minded had been replaced with offices that communicated with others through the revolutionary telegraph system. This allowed Britain to trade with the entire world, which was only improved further in 1877 with the invention of the telephone. The English scientist and inventor Henry Fox Talbot invented the first photographs in 1834, which were known as sun pictures. These became wildly popular and were sold as cartes de visite, very small photographs that were often given to people as visiting cards. Among the most popular subjects distributed was Queen Victoria and her children, which was the first time most people had seen their queen outside of officially painted portraits. At the Great Exhibition, George Jennings presented his state-of-the-art lavatories, which he called halting stations. This invention proved to be more sanitary than people relieving themselves in secluded corners of the street, which led to public lavatories being erected. In 1852, a men's room was built in Fleet Street, with a woman's lavatory being built in the Strand. It was Thomas Crapper who developed the flush aspect of the lavatory and also invented the U-bend. Many believe that the word for bodily waste came from Thomas Crapper's name, although the word crap actually came from the Dutch word krappen, which means to separate, and the Old French word crap, which means waste or rejected matter. Because cotton needs to be produced in a humid environment, many manufacturers established their factories in Manchester because of the volume of rain the city gets. Unfortunately, the factories were still full of dust and cotton fibers in the air, which resulted in many workers suffering from breathing illnesses. The large machines in these factories also posed a risk, with many of them not having any form of safety protocols or guards. This led to several cases of women being scalped after their hair got caught, as well as hands, fingers, and arms being caught and crushed in the moving parts. Children were often sent into or beneath the machines to clear blockages or replace intricate parts, which also ended in terrible accidents. Elsewhere in the country, the gentry owning large portions of land was becoming incredibly rich from coal mining, with the industries utilizing steam power keeping the demand high. While mining kept the country thriving, the conditions deep down in the earth were terrible. Children were hired to drag the wagons from the coalface to the shaft foot, which would then be lifted to the surface because they were much cheaper and more obedient than horse-drawn carts. This was incredibly hard work and run the risk of being caught in a collapse. Mines got incredibly hot, which meant that workers wore very little clothing and had to drink beer to keep hydrated. The reason they drank alcohol was down to the poor quality of water, which caused diarrhea, dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, which would prove deadly to its drinkers. In 1815, Sir Humphrey Davy invented the safety lamp. which allowed deeper excavations into the earth. Later, ventilation techniques were implemented, although it wasn't until 1848 that compressed air systems were invented. Employing children under the age of 12 was banned in 1860, although the number of employees grew from 200,000 to 500,000 in Britain. This allowed 30 million tons of coal to be excavated in 1836, which rose to an incredible 44 million tons by 1880. By 1850, a person could only work for 10 hours a day with night work abolished. This meant that the average working day lasted from 6 in the morning to 6 in the afternoon. Also in 1850, lighting and ventilation regulations came into effect for mining, further improving the well-being of the workers. With that being said, mining was still an incredibly dangerous job, which wouldn't have been properly improved until the 1900s. It had become common practice to pay workers with tokens that could only be used at selected shops instead of paying them money. This led to shops inflating prices and providing poor quality items, as workers had no other choice. The Truck Act, established in 1831, set to end this practice, but it took a long time for it to end completely. The British Empire proved itself to be the most innovative and captive market in the entire world due to its industrial breakthroughs. Unfortunately, it was this achievement that became its own downfall when it came to keeping all of its territories, as the prosperity inspired parts of the empire to become separate entities to seek their own success. At the time, the United States was growing at an incredible rate, forging its own legacy in technology and innovation. After the death of Franz Ferdinand and his morganatic wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, which led to the July Crisis. Eventually, on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Along with other countries, Britain offered up its services in what is now known as the First World War. This explosive period ushered in the modern age, where the focus shifted from the monarchy and industrial revolution to the development of weaponry and strategic warfare that took the lives of millions. Due to trench warfare, the country saw unprecedented levels of death. By the time the fighting came to an end, 16 million lives, both soldiers and civilians, were lost. At this point, Britain was dependent on its industry and agriculture sectors. Industries shifted their production to supplying munitions for the war effort, with many forced to by the government. Agriculture supplied food to the country, as stocks being imported to the country became limited due to the threat of the enemy. While young men were enlisted in the army, women had to go work in factories, making bullets and uniforms, as well as working on farms. Women also worked in nursing and caring roles, as the casualties took their toll on resources. While it was those on the front line that fought for victory, it would not have been possible without the efforts of those back home in Britain. At the start of the war, miners were told not to join the army, as they needed to provide coal for the war effort. As the conflict raged on, however, miners were drafted as tunnelers, who were tasked with the dangerous job of digging tunnels to set explosives beneath enemy trenches, as well as placing landmines on the battlefield. The Germans were far more prepared for the war, which gave them a massive advantage in trench warfare. While there was a focus on drafting experienced miners, there was not enough to fill the quota, which led to civilians being trained as miners and sent to war. Eventually, the British were more skilled at tunneling than the Germans. With many miners enlisted in the army, there was a shortage of coal in October 1916, which led to the supply being rationed per household. Those who refused to enlist in the army were forced to become miners instead to help maximize the coal supply. Many people working in agriculture were enlisted in the army, which greatly affected the industry. Because U-boats were blocking imports coming into the country, farm work was crucial. This work was only made more difficult as blacksmiths and plowmen were taken from farms to fight, making it incredibly difficult to replace them. In order to replace the male farm workers, the Women's Land Army was established, which sent 260,000 women to farms to help agriculture work continue. While the war ended on November 11, 1918, sadly, this wasn't the last time Britain saw war and mass death. With World War II breaking out in 1945 when Germany invaded Poland. Between 1945 and 1951, Britain was healing from the effects of World War II, with the Labour Party leading the charge after replacing Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister who was hailed a hero for the part he played in the war.
5 years ago, I promised you blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And your untiring response brought us, in the end, victory over Germany.
The Labour Party had been established in 1900 to oppose the Conservative Party, which had been the country's oldest political party. The Conservative Party won the election in 1945 by a landslide, and was favored as people believed that the government didn't understand the needs of ordinary people. Despite Churchill's impressive leadership during the war, many believed that he wouldn't be a good leader during a time of peace. During this period, the Labour Party established national insurance in 1946, as well as the NHS, the National Health Service, which has been providing free healthcare for the British nation since 1948. Industrial sectors such as mining, banking, gas, and aviation were nationalized, which allowed environments to be made much safer for workers. Eventually, the economy recovered, and industries returned to the efficiency and profitability they had experienced before. Shortly after World War II, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union began. In order to bolster the forces of their allies, the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, offered Britain's support to the United States. Britain also participated in the Korean War in 1950 on the side of South Korea, alongside America. Britain later became an original member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. This treaty was established with the United States and other European nations in order to protect them from the Soviet Union, who were developing nuclear warfare. In 1947, India successfully achieved independence, taking the jewel of the British crown away. This was the start of the British Empire's dismantlement after centuries of taking territories for their own. Between 1950 and 2000, Britain changed in many ways. Immigration increased, class division had completely ended, and the welfare state was established. With the loss of many colonies and territories, Britain joined a union with Europe. The manufacturing industries that made the country thrive shifted to providing services and relying on imports rather than producing them within the country. Although Britain saw inflation and recessions, the standard of living was at an all-time high. On February 6, 1952, Queen Elizabeth II was named the Queen of England, following the death of King George VI, her father. King George had to have one of his lungs removed after it became cancerous from years of smoking. Although he did recover from the surgery, he suddenly passed away in his sleep from a coronary thrombosis, a type of blood clot in the heart. Although Britain was in peacetime after 1945, the threat of the Cold War led to the country spending heavily on defense, military supplies, and training. The threat of nuclear attack was terrifying, which led to funds being channeled into developing defenses. The leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, which was a huge blow to Britain's trade economy. In response, Britain, France, and Israel decided to invade Egypt in order to govern the Suez Canal network. This was met with a lot of criticism from the United States and other countries, including the Soviet Union. This opposition led to the United Kingdom withdrawing from the invasion, as the United States and the United Nations put a lot of pressure on them. This resulted in the value of the pound dropping, as international investors withdrew their interest in assets. This led to a financial crisis that proved that Britain needed to rely on allies when it came to military strategy following the two world wars. The 1960s brought a new age of liberation and expression, with the culture shifting to new art, experimental music, and creative fashion. This period of anti-conservatism moved away from traditional institutions and practices, further diminishing the class divide. The country also went through a period of reform, which tackled issues such as abortion, divorce, sexual orientation, and racial discrimination, subjects that were taboo up until this point. Unfortunately, this period also saw one of the worst economic states the country has ever seen. Britain was spending too much money on their defenses and imports and wasn't investing enough in industry, causing jobs to be lost and profits to fall. In the 1960s, the relationship between the Unionists and Republicans in Northern Ireland broke down, with conflicts breaking out between the two factions. The Unionists wanted to remain within the United Kingdom, while the Republicans fought for independence as they wanted a united Ireland. In 1969, Britain sent its army into Northern Ireland to quell the conflict, which was met with retaliation from the Irish Republican Army, who violently attacked soldiers. In 1972, 14 Irish Catholics were killed during a march, which became known as Bloody Sunday. This only heightened tensions, which led to Britain taking over the control of the Northern Ireland government. While this was only meant to be for a short period of time, it lasted 35 years. Britain tried to share power between the two Irish factions, but the plan failed, and violence broke out once again in 1974. The price of oil rose exponentially in the 1970s due to other countries taking control of their own industries, which severely affected the British economy. This crisis led to union strikes and the Labour Party coming into power. Led by Margaret Thatcher, Britain's economy saw massive changes made.
The message is, Mr. President, that Tory philosophy works when we have the courage to put it into practice and the perseverance to see it through.
Not all of which were met with a positive response. Following the monetarism theory, the government made many cuts to spending, which caused many jobs to be lost. This caused the 1981 riots that saw youths lash out about poor job prospects and the feeling of discrimination among the black community. In 1982, Argentina took over the Falklands, which was a British territory at the time. Margaret Thatcher managed to defeat Argentina over control, which boosted her popularity in the country for a short period of time. By the middle of the 1980s, privatization was in full swing. This allowed more British people to invest in shares, which increased profits for the government.
$350 Swiss.
Zurich 23, Citibank.
Around this time, in 1985, the Irish Republic accepted Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, although conflicts within the country continued. With the new millennium being ushered in and the digital age taking root, the British Empire came to an end, with many of its territories now given independence. Britain entered into a union with Europe to bolster its economy and trade industry, but this split opinions. Eventually, it led to the 2016 Brexit, where the majority of the British people chose to leave the Union.
Elizabeth leaves Westminster.
The Queen is crowned, symbol of hope.
Queen Elizabeth rides forth.
Another extraordinary chapter has been written.
With the death of Queen Elizabeth II on September 8, 2022, after reigning for an incredible 70 years and 214 days, the United Kingdom moved into a brand new era. In 2023, the country now faces an energy crisis, while continuing its efforts to deter conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Throughout its incredible history, the United Kingdom has made many integral contributions to the world, from industry to culture. Since World War II, Britain has made a huge impact on culture, literature, film, television, music, and theater, which continues to act as an inspiration for many nations. The most significant contribution, however, would be the English language itself, which has become a universal language around the globe, which has brought many cultures, economies, and nations together.